For 43 years, Ruth Whitaker had been the woman people trusted with spare keys, sealed envelopes, sickroom prayers, and the quiet fears they were too proud to say aloud. In the small coastal town of Hartleigh Bay, Ruth Whitaker was not rich, not powerful, and not the kind of person who raised her voice in a room. She was a retired district nurse, a widow, and the volunteer treasurer of the Harbor Light Benevolent Fund, a local charity that paid heating bills for pensioners, bought bus passes for hospital appointments, and kept lonely people from feeling invisible. Then, one wet November morning, the same town that had once left casseroles on her doorstep began whispering that Ruth Whitaker had stolen from the old and the sick. They said she had taken money meant for winter fuel. They said she had covered her tracks with trembling hands and a kind smile. They said old age had made her careless, greedy, or confused. Some said it gently, as though pity made accusation kinder. Others said it with satisfaction, the way people do when goodness turns out to have a stain. Ruth Whitaker lost her place at the charity table. She lost the choir seat she had occupied for nearly 30 years. She lost the small circle of friends who used to wave from the bakery window. Worse than that, she lost the one thing she had believed no one could take from her at 76, her good name. The betrayal did not come from a stranger. It came from Peter Langford, the polished charity chairman who called her our moral compass, and Oliver Keene, the soft-spoken accountant who had sat beside her every month, praising her careful handwriting and making tea when her arthritis hurt. They thought Ruth Whitaker was too old to understand online banking logs. They thought she was too ashamed to fight back. They thought a widow with no children and no expensive solicitor would accept disgrace because disgrace can feel easier than battle when a town has already decided who you are. They were wrong. Because hidden inside the ordinary machinery of bank statements, email timestamps, scanned minutes, and one frightened young volunteer's conscience was a trail neither Peter Langford nor Oliver Keene had thought to erase. It would not bring justice in a single dramatic afternoon. It would not make pain disappear. Truth rarely moves that quickly, but it would move, line by line, date by date, signature by signature. And before the winter was over, the people of Hartleigh Bay would learn that sometimes the weakest person in the room is only the one everyone has underestimated. Before the accusation, before the closed doors and lowered eyes, Ruth Whitaker's life had been modest enough to be overlooked and steady enough to be envied. Her cottage sat 3 streets back from the seafront, where the gulls shouted over the rooftops and salt gathered on window panes, no matter how often she wiped them. The front garden was small, with lavender by the gate and a stubborn rosebush that had survived 2 storms, 1 hard frost, and the death of her husband, Arthur Whitaker. Arthur Whitaker had been gone 9 years. Ruth Whitaker still kept his gardening gloves on the hook by the back door, not because she expected him to return, but because removing them felt like declaring something too final. Their marriage had been quiet and practical. They were not the sort of couple who made speeches about love. Arthur Whitaker fixed things before they broke. Ruth Whitaker remembered how people took their tea. Between them, they had built a life of small kindnesses. They never had children. For years, people had asked why with a bluntness that only respectable people seemed to allow themselves. Ruth Whitaker had answered in different ways depending on the day. Sometimes she said it was not meant to be. Sometimes she said nursing had given her enough children to worry over. Sometimes she smiled and changed the subject. Only Arthur Whitaker had known the full ache of it, and he had never pressed the wound with words. After Arthur Whitaker died, Ruth Whitaker discovered that loneliness did not arrive all at once. It came in little absences, no second toothbrush in the cup, no cough from the sitting room, no one to say that the milk had turned or that the forecast looked wrong. At first, the silence frightened her. Then she learned to fill it with routine. Every Monday, Ruth Whitaker walked to the community library to help older residents fill in benefit forms and hospital travel claims. Every Wednesday, she attended the Harbor Light Benevolent Fund office, a converted room behind the Methodist chapel that smelled of paper, polish, and damp coats. Every Friday, she bought 1 cod fillet from Harrigan's fish shop and pretended she was not still cooking for 2. The Harbor Light Benevolent Fund had been part of Hartleigh Bay for nearly 70 years. It began after the war, when fishermen's widows and retired dock workers needed help with coal and rent. Over time, it became a respectable local charity with trustees, annual accounts, fundraisers, and a brass plaque in the chapel hallway. It was small enough that everyone knew someone it had helped, but big enough that people liked to be seen giving to it. Ruth Whitaker had become treasurer, almost by accident. The old treasurer had fallen ill, the books were in confusion, and Ruth Whitaker, who had spent decades keeping district nursing records clean enough to satisfy the strictest matron, offered to help for 1 month. 1 month became 1 year. 1 year became 21. Her methods were old-fashioned, but not careless. Ruth Whitaker kept a red cash book for petty cash, a blue folder for invoices, a green folder for grant letters, and a narrow black notebook in which she wrote questions to ask at the next trustees' meeting. She used online banking only after the bank insisted it would reduce delays, and even then she printed every confirmation and clipped it to the relevant invoice. People teased her for it. Peter Langford called her the last honest ledger in England. Oliver Keene said her folders were more reliable than software. Ruth Whitaker did not mind. She believed records were a kind of respect. When money was donated for vulnerable people, every pound deserved to know where it had gone. Peter Langford joined the charity 5 years before the scandal. He had returned to Hartleigh Bay after a career in property development and civic committees. He wore tailored coats, spoke with a warm authority, and knew how to make donors feel that giving money was both generous and socially wise. Within months, he was chairman. Peter Langford had a gift for rooms. He remembered names, touched elbows, and used phrases like community resilience and dignified support in ways that sounded meaningful even when no one could quite define them. Local businesses liked him because he made charity look efficient. Church members liked him because he nodded solemnly during prayers. The council liked him because he could write funding applications without sounding desperate. Ruth Whitaker liked him too at first. He seemed to respect the past without being trapped by it. He listened when she explained why the fund never paid cash directly to applicants unless there was a clear receipt. He praised Arthur Whitaker's old service in the lifeboat crew. He once carried 3 boxes of donated blankets in the rain and joked that his expensive shoes deserved a moral purpose. Oliver Keene joined shortly after Peter Langford. Unlike Peter Langford, Oliver Keene did not dominate a room. He was in his late 40s, narrow-shouldered with tired eyes and a habit of folding paper napkins into tiny squares. He ran a small accountancy practice above a travel agency on East Street. Peter Langford recommended him as a volunteer advisor when new charity reporting requirements became too much for Ruth Whitaker to manage alone. Ruth Whitaker was grateful. Oliver Keene never made her feel foolish for asking questions. He explained spreadsheets slowly. He showed her how to export bank statements. He spoke softly about his mother, who had dementia in a care home near Bristol, and Ruth Whitaker felt that he understood the fragility of later life. There was also Clara Finch, who came to the Harbor Light Benevolent Fund through the community library. Clara Finch was 26, quiet and clever in the way of people who notice everything, because they are not used to being noticed themselves. She helped with social media posts, scanned old documents, and taught pensioners how to enlarge text on their phones. Ruth Whitaker liked Clara Finch's patience. It did not have that bright performative tone young people sometimes used with the old. Clara Finch treated people as if they were simply people. For a while, the charity flourished. Peter Langford brought in corporate sponsorship from estate agents and holiday lets. Oliver Keene modernized the accounts. Clara Finch created a simple website where residents could apply for help. Ruth Whitaker continued to verify requests, call suppliers, and make sure no one was reduced to begging for what they needed. The first sign that something was wrong was small enough to excuse. In early March, Ruth Whitaker noticed a payment to a printing company she did not recognize. The invoice said it was for fundraising brochures. The amount was not enormous, but Ruth Whitaker had never seen the brochures. At the trustees' meeting, she asked Peter Langford about it. Peter Langford smiled, not dismissively but with a touch of amusement. He said the brochures were for the spring donor luncheon. He said Oliver Keene had approved the invoice while Ruth Whitaker was recovering from a chest infection. He said everything had been properly noted. Ruth Whitaker looked at Oliver Keene. Oliver Keene nodded and said he had the paperwork on file. He offered to send it again. Ruth Whitaker said that would be fine. The paperwork arrived 2 days later. It looked ordinary. The company existed. The invoice number was there. The description was vague, but many small suppliers were vague. Ruth Whitaker filed it and told herself not to become the sort of elderly volunteer who resented change, because it came without asking her permission first. Then another payment appeared. This one was for consultancy work connected to a winter impact campaign. Again, Peter Langford had an explanation. The charity needed stronger donor materials. The council expected professional language. Small charities had to adapt. He said all this gently, with sympathy for how tiring paperwork had become. Ruth Whitaker heard the kindness in his voice and felt ashamed of her suspicion. That shame was the first weapon used against her. By summer, Peter Langford had begun suggesting that Ruth Whitaker take a less demanding role. He did not say she was too old. He would never be so crude. He said she had given enough. He said Arthur Whitaker would want her to rest. He said the charity systems had become complex and she should not feel pressured to keep up with every digital detail. Ruth Whitaker refused at first. The Harbor Light Benevolent Fund was not only work, it was structure, it was purpose. It was the place where the years she had left still felt useful, but the comments kept coming, always softened with praise. At the same time, people began treating Ruth Whitaker differently. A trustee named Helen Moore started double-check simple things Ruth Whitaker had handled for years. A church warden asked whether she needed help counting collection money. A volunteer suggested making the meeting minutes clearer for Ruth Whitaker. No one accused her of incompetence. That would have been easier to answer. Instead, they wrapped doubt and concern. Ruth Whitaker began to sleep badly. At night, she sat at the kitchen table with bank statements spread before her, tracing payments with a ruler. Some were unfamiliar but not obviously fraudulent. They had descriptions that sounded charitable: outreach support, donor engagement, administrative transition, community strategy, words that turned money into mist. When Ruth Whitaker asked Oliver Keene to explain the categories, Oliver Keene seemed nervous. He said small charities needed better language for grants. He said Peter Langford had approved them. He said he would send a summary. The summary did not arrive. Then in August, Ruth Whitaker's online banking access failed. She entered the password she had written in her locked notebook, but the system rejected it. She tried again, hands stiff with anxiety. It rejected her again. She phoned the bank. After security checks, a young employee said a password reset had been completed the previous week. Ruth Whitaker said she had not reset anything. The employee hesitated. Then the employee said another authorized user might have done it. The charity had multiple signatories. Ruth Whitaker asked for details. The employee said the bank could not discuss certain account security information over the phone without further verification. Ruth Whitaker went to the branch the next morning. The branch of Wessex and County Bank stood on the corner of Market Street, between a chemist and a vacant shop that used to sell shoes. Ruth Whitaker had known the old manager, but the old manager had retired. The new staff were polite and efficient in a way that made politeness feel like a wall. Grace Bell was at the customer service desk that day. Grace Bell was 32, with dark curls pinned untidily, and a voice that became softer when she noticed someone was frightened. Grace Bell had helped Ruth Whitaker before when a charity debit card was delayed. Ruth Whitaker explained that she could not access the account. Grace Bell checked the screen, asked for identification, and frowned just slightly before smoothing her expression. Grace Bell said there had been administrative changes to the charity mandate. Ruth Whitaker was still listed, but certain online permissions had been adjusted. The request had come through with forms signed by 2 trustees. Ruth Whitaker asked to see the forms. Grace Bell said she could not release copies at the desk, but Ruth Whitaker could submit a formal request through the charity or ask the trustees to obtain them. Grace Bell looked uncomfortable as she said it. Ruth Whitaker walked out into the wind, with her handbag held tightly against her coat. She had the oddest feeling that the pavement had shifted while she was inside. At the next trustees meeting, Peter Langford announced a financial review. He said donor confidence depended on transparency. He said irregularities had been found in past records. He said no conclusions should be drawn prematurely. Everyone looked at Ruth Whitaker without looking at Ruth Whitaker. Peter Langford placed a folder on the table. Inside were printed transaction lists with highlighted withdrawals, supplier payments, and reimbursements. Some had Ruth Whitaker's initials beside them. Some had notes that appeared to be in her handwriting but were not quite her handwriting. The differences were subtle. A loop too wide, a date written in a sharper hand, her name used as a shield. Ruth Whitaker felt heat rise in her face. She said she had not approved those payments. Peter Langford sighed. It was a sad sigh, almost affectionate. He said no one was accusing her of anything yet. He said memory could be unreliable under stress. He said grief and age played tricks, especially when someone had carried responsibility for too long. He said the priority was protecting the charity. Ruth Whitaker asked Oliver Keene to speak. Oliver Keene kept his eyes on the table. He said the records were confused. He said he had raised concerns privately. He said there were gaps. The room seemed to shrink around Ruth Whitaker. She wanted to protest. She wanted to slap the folder shut. She wanted to remind them of every winter bill she had paid, every widow she had sat beside, every late evening spent balancing pennies no one else cared about. But she had spent her life with the sick, the dying, and the proud. She knew the danger of pleading when people have already decided that pleading is proof. So Ruth Whitaker folded her hands and said she would cooperate with any proper review. Peter Langford nodded as if she had finally behaved sensibly. Within a week, the story left the meeting room. No one admitted who had spread it. In a town like Hartleigh Bay, rumors did not travel by one road. They seeped under doors and through checkout queues. They disguised themselves as concern. People said there had been irregularities at the Harbor Light Benevolent Fund. People said Ruth Whitaker had been under strain. People said no one really knew what grief did to a person. People said it was sad, terribly sad. People said the charity must come first. The cruelest part was how carefully everyone avoided cruelty. The butcher asked if Ruth Whitaker wanted the cheaper cut today, as though money had become a subject between them. The woman at the post office stopped chatting and served her quickly. A man whose gas bill the charity had once paid crossed the street when he saw her. At chapel, someone had removed Ruth Whitaker from the rota for reading the lesson. No explanation was given. Ruth Whitaker sat through the Sunday service with her back straight. She knew people were watching for signs. Tears would mean guilt to some and weakness to others. Anger would mean confusion. Staying home would mean shame, so she stayed, sang quietly, and left before tea. That evening, Ruth Whitaker took Arthur Whitaker's old biscuit tin from the top of the wardrobe. Inside were savings bonds, their marriage certificate, funeral receipts, and letters Arthur Whitaker had written when the lifeboat crew was called out during storms. At the bottom was a photograph of Ruth Whitaker at 34, standing beside a district nursing car, with her hair blown across her face and a medical bag in her hand. She stared at the younger woman and wondered when people had stopped seeing her as that person. Not young, not invincible, but capable. The fear that settled over Ruth Whitaker was not simply fear of being blamed, it was fear of being erased. If Peter Langford could turn a lifetime of careful service into a question mark, then what remained? If every act of trust could be rewritten as foolishness, every record dismissed as confusion, every protest filed under old age, then she was not fighting for money alone. She was fighting for the right to remain the author of her own life. At first, Ruth Whitaker did not know how to fight. She had no children to storm into offices on her behalf. No nephew with legal training. No husband to stand beside her in public and make people hesitate before insulting her. The absence of family had never felt like a public weakness before. Now it felt visible. For 3 days, Ruth Whitaker stayed mostly indoors. She answered no phone calls except one from the chemist. She ate toast because cooking seemed too hopeful. She opened the red cash book and closed it again. Her hands trembled, not from age but from the effort of holding herself together. On the 4th day, Clara Finch came to the cottage. Ruth Whitaker almost did not answer. When she opened the door, Clara Finch was standing in the rain with a paper bag from the bakery and a face full of worry she was trying not to show. Clara Finch did not say she believed Ruth Whitaker, not immediately. Perhaps that was why Ruth Whitaker let her in. Big declarations would have sounded like pity. Clara Finch simply said she had brought soup, and that the bakery had made too many rolls. It was an obvious lie. Ruth Whitaker accepted it. They sat at the kitchen table. For a while they spoke about ordinary things. The leak in the library roof, the price of butter, the gull that had stolen a sausage roll from a tourist's hand. Then Clara Finch looked at the folders stacked by the wall. Clara Finch said the website had been changed. Some of the old trustee minutes had disappeared from the public archive. She said she had not done it. She said Peter Langford had asked for the administrator password in June because he wanted to tidy old material. She said it had bothered her, but not enough at the time. Ruth Whitaker felt something inside her sharpen. She asked whether anything had been backed up. Clara Finch hesitated. Then Clara Finch said the library computer might still have scanned copies of old minutes and invoices. When she digitized old records, she had saved them to a shared folder before uploading them. She was supposed to delete local copies afterward, but the library computer was slow, and sometimes she forgot. Ruth Whitaker did not smile, not yet. Hope was dangerous when it came too early, but she stood, took down the black notebook, and opened a clean page. For the first time since the accusation, Ruth Whitaker began writing questions not to defend herself emotionally, but to establish facts. Who requested the bank mandate change? Who signed the forms? Which payments were unknown? Which documents disappeared? Who had website access? Who benefited? Clara Finch watched her write. Then Clara Finch took out her phone and said she could make a list of the missing website pages. That was how the fight began, not with a speech, not with a confrontation. With soup cooling on the table and two women making a list while rain tapped the glass. The next week, Ruth Whitaker returned to Wessex and County Bank with a written request. She asked for copies of the mandate variation forms, access logs were available, and a formal review of disputed transactions. She used phrases Grace Bell had quietly suggested during a brief phone call: data subject request, authorized signatory, fraud concern, internal investigation, complaint reference. Grace Bell could not become Ruth Whitaker's advocate. Bank employees had rules. But Grace Bell did something more valuable than comfort. Grace Bell treated Ruth Whitaker as competent. She explained process. She wrote down the correct address for the complaint team. She said the bank would have audit trails even if those trails were not immediately visible to branch staff. She did not promise an outcome. Ruth Whitaker thanked Grace Bell for not speaking to her, as if she were made of glass. Grace Bell looked down and said her grandmother had stopped going to the bank after one clerk called her dear 7 times and answered none of her questions. The first formal response from the bank was cautious. It acknowledged receipt. It said the matter was under review. It said the charity account had several authorized persons and that the bank would examine disputed access and transaction history. It did not accuse anyone. It did not clear anyone. Still, it was a document. Ruth Whitaker filed it in a new yellow folder labeled evidence. Meanwhile, Peter Langford accelerated. At a special trustees meeting, Ruth Whitaker was asked to step aside as treasurer pending investigation. She was not allowed to see all the documents because, Peter Langford said, there were concerns about integrity of records. Helen Moore avoided eye contact. Oliver Keene looked pale. Two newer trustees seemed embarrassed, but relieved that someone else was handling the unpleasantness. Ruth Whitaker asked whether an independent examiner had been appointed. Peter Langford said Oliver Keene was preparing the necessary review. Ruth Whitaker said Oliver Keene could not independently review accounts he had helped maintain. Peter Langford's smile hardened for half a second. Then he said her point was noted. It was not noted. 2 days later, a letter arrived. It was written on Harbor Light Benevolent Fund stationery and signed by Peter Langford. It informed Ruth Whitaker that due to concerns regarding financial management, she was suspended from all charity activities, including applicant assessments and access to records. It thanked her for her years of service. That final sentence hurt more than the rest. It turned her life into a polite dismissal. Ruth Whitaker placed the letter in the yellow folder. Then she went to the community library. The library was warm and smelled of carpet cleaner and old pages. Daniel Price, the retired history teacher who volunteered on Tuesdays, was repairing a jammed printer with the seriousness of a surgeon. Daniel Price had known Ruth Whitaker for years, mostly through quiet nods and conversations about large print crime novels. He was not a dramatic man. That made his kindness easier to bear. Clara Finch had arranged for them to use the small archive room. On the library computer, they searched the shared folder. There were old scans, not everything, but enough to matter: meeting minutes, grant letters, invoices, a copy of the trustee resolution from the previous year approving a dual authorization policy for payments over a certain amount, a scanned page showing that Ruth Whitaker had objected to vague consultancy fees in May. Daniel Price knew more about metadata than Ruth Whitaker expected. He had spent years teaching students not to trust copied essays. He explained that files often carried creation dates, modification dates, and user information. He did not make it sound magical. He made it sound like footprints in damp sand. They saved copies to a new drive. Clara Finch printed a directory list. Ruth Whitaker signed and dated each page in the corner, not because it was legally conclusive, but because order helped her breathe. Among the scanned documents was a meeting minute from February. It stated clearly that any new supplier above a modest threshold required prior trustee approval and 2 signatories, not including the supplier reviewer. Ruth Whitaker had forgotten the wording, but there it was. Peter Langford had chaired that meeting. Oliver Keene had attended. Both had praised the policy at the time. Several questionable payments violated it. That did not prove theft, but it proved Peter Langford's story was incomplete. The next discovery came from Clara Finch. In July, Peter Langford had asked Clara Finch to send donor campaign materials to a print contact. Clara Finch had received a forwarded email chain from Oliver Keene with attachments. She had never opened the full thread because Peter Langford later told her the print order was canceled. But the email still sat in her archive. When Clara Finch expanded the thread, she found a message Peter Langford had sent Oliver Keene 3 days before the disputed printing invoice. It was brief. Use the Tuesday batch. It will sit better with Ruth Whitaker's usual payments. Keep the description bland. No one in the archive room spoke for several seconds. Ruth Whitaker read it again. The words did not say steal money. They did not say frame Ruth Whitaker. People like Peter Langford rarely wrote their sins in plain English. But the message had direction, timing, and intent. It placed Peter Langford behind a transaction he had later described as routine. Daniel Price said the email header should be preserved. Clara Finch said she could export the message as a file, not just print it. Ruth Whitaker asked them to do both. That night, Ruth Whitaker slept for 4 straight hours. It was not peace. It was strength returning in small portions. The trouble with truth is that it often becomes heavier before it becomes useful. Ruth Whitaker now had questions, copies, and 1 suggestive email. But Peter Langford had position. Oliver Keene had technical control. The trustees had fear. The town had already tasted scandal and did not want to admit it had swallowed too quickly. Peter Langford invited Ruth Whitaker to meet him privately at the charity office. Clara Finch begged her not to go alone. Ruth Whitaker agreed. She asked Daniel Price to wait in the chapel hallway, close enough to see when she left. She did not go in expecting confession. She went to learn what Peter Langford thought she knew. The office had changed. Her folders were gone from the shelf. A new laptop sat on the desk. Peter Langford offered tea. Ruth Whitaker declined. Peter Langford spoke gently at first. He said he had tried to protect her. He said the situation was becoming difficult. He said if she resigned quietly, the charity might decide not to pursue matters further. He used the word dignity twice. Ruth Whitaker asked what matters he meant. Peter Langford looked disappointed, as if she were failing a test of gratitude. He said there were payments with her initials. He said there were supplier records she could not explain. He said the bank would not appreciate confusion around access. He said public disputes harmed vulnerable beneficiaries. Ruth Whitaker said vulnerable beneficiaries had already been harmed if money was missing. Peter Langford leaned back, the warmth drained from his face. He said he had always admired her, but stubbornness was not innocence. He said people would be kinder if she accepted that she had made mistakes. He said no one expected a woman of her age to master modern systems. There it was, not concern, not protection, contempt wearing a clean shirt. Ruth Whitaker stood. She said she would not resign. She said any proper investigation should be independent. She said she had requested bank records and preserved documents. Peter Langford's eyes changed, just for a moment. The moment was small, but Ruth Whitaker had spent decades noticing pain behind polite faces. Fear has its own expression. He recovered quickly. He said she was being influenced by people who did not understand consequences. He said Clara Finch was a temporary volunteer with no stake in the charity. He said Daniel Price was a lonely old man looking for excitement. Ruth Whitaker left without answering. In the hallway, Daniel Price pretended to read a notice about harvest donations. Ruth Whitaker told him it was time to contact someone outside Hartleigh Bay. Finding proper help was not simple. Ruth Whitaker could not afford a long legal battle. She had a small pension, a little savings, and the cottage she hoped never to mortgage. She phoned 3 solicitors. One was too expensive. One said charity disputes were complicated. One offered a short fixed-fee appointment with a solicitor named Aisha Rahman in a nearby town. Aisha Rahman listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then Aisha Rahman said Ruth Whitaker needed to separate 3 things: the charity's internal governance, any possible fraud, and Ruth Whitaker's personal reputation. Aisha Rahman said England and Wales did not run on whispered certainty. There were duties, records, bank processes, charity reporting obligations, and evidence. She said the Charity Commission could be contacted if there were serious concerns about mismanagement or misconduct. She said police involvement might come later if fraud evidence was strong, but Ruth Whitaker should not expect instant drama. Ruth Whitaker almost laughed at that. Instant drama had already happened. It was justice that seemed slow. Aisha Rahman helped Ruth Whitaker draft letters. One requested that the trustees appoint an independent examiner with no prior involvement. One put the charity on notice that Ruth Whitaker disputed the allegations and required preservation of all records, emails, device logs, bank mandates, invoices, and minutes. One asked Peter Langford to identify the basis on which he had restricted her access while implying wrongdoing. The letters were calm. That made them powerful. When Peter Langford received them, he made his first mistake in public. He told a group after Sunday service that Ruth Whitaker had lawyered up. It was meant to sound defensive and guilty. But to some ears it sounded like a woman refusing to be quietly buried. Helen Moore's husband, who had once served as a magistrate, remarked that everyone was entitled to advice. Someone else asked why an independent review had not already begun. Whispers shifted. Not in Ruth Whitaker's favor yet, but away from certainty, Peter Langford noticed. He called an emergency trustee meeting and announced that, for the sake of transparency, he had appointed an independent reviewer. The reviewer was not independent. It was a colleague of Oliver Keene's from a professional networking group, someone who had previously shared clients with him. Ruth Whitaker's solicitor objected in writing. The objection became part of the record. That phrase began to matter to Ruth Whitaker. Part of the record. It meant a fact no longer floated helplessly in air. It had a place to stand. The bank's first substantive letter arrived in late October. Ruth Whitaker opened it with Clara Finch sitting beside her and Daniel Price standing near the kettle as if tea could become emergency medicine. The letter did not reveal everything. It said the bank had identified several logins and payment instructions made using credentials associated with Ruth Whitaker's user profile, during periods when Ruth Whitaker stated she had not accessed the system. It said device and network information did not match Ruth Whitaker's usual access patterns. It said the mandate variation forms were being reviewed because of possible discrepancies in signatures and witness details. It said the bank had temporarily restricted certain account functions and referred the matter to its internal fraud team. Ruth Whitaker read the paragraph 3 times. Associated with her user profile. Not made by her. Possible discrepancies. Internal fraud team. For 2 months, people had spoken as if her denial was sentimental. Now the bank was saying the machines remembered differently. The letter also said that charity, as account holder, would receive further communication through appropriate officers. That worried Aisha Rahman. If Peter Langford remained chairman, he might control what trustees saw. Aisha Rahman advised Ruth Whitaker to write directly to all trustees, enclosing the bank's letter and requesting an urgent meeting without Oliver Keene present due to conflict. Concerns. Ruth Whitaker did so. Helen Moore phoned the next morning. For a moment, Ruth Whitaker considered not answering. Helen Moore had sat silent while Peter Langford humiliated her. Helen Moore had removed her from the reading rota. Helen Moore had believed concern could excuse cowardice, but Ruth Whitaker answered. Helen Moore cried. Ruth Whitaker wished she had not. Tears from someone who has injured you can become another burden. Helen Moore said she had thought Peter Langford knew more than he was saying. Helen Moore said Oliver Keene had shown her spreadsheets. Helen Moore said she did not want to damage the charity. Helen Moore said she was sorry. Ruth Whitaker listened. Then Ruth Whitaker said sorry would have to become action. It was the first time in years Ruth Whitaker heard her own voice sound hard. Helen Moore agreed to support an emergency trustees meeting. 2 others followed. Peter Langford resisted, then agreed, when refusing began to look worse than attending. The meeting took place in the chapel hall on a Thursday evening. Rain struck the high windows. Folding chairs scraped the floor. Ruth Whitaker attended with Aisha Rahman as a legal advisor. Oliver Keene attended despite objections, claiming his presence was necessary to explain accounting details. Peter Langford sat at the head of the table, jaw tight but smile intact. Ruth Whitaker did not make a speech. Aisha Rahman distributed a bundle of documents, the bank letter, scanned minutes, the February policy, transaction lists, the exported email thread with visible timestamps, and a schedule of disputed payments. Each document was numbered, each assertion tied to evidence. Peter Langford called it aggressive. Aisha Rahman called it organized. Oliver Keene began to sweat. The most damaging item that night was not the email. It was a simple table Clara Finch had helped prepare. It matched disputed payments with dates Ruth Whitaker could prove she was elsewhere. On one date, Ruth Whitaker had been at a hospital eye appointment, confirmed by an NHS letter. On another, she had been attending Arthur Whitaker's memorial service with neighbors who could verify the time. On a third, her home internet had been down all day due to a service outage documented by her provider, while the charity banking login came from a commercial broadband address near East Street. East Street was where Oliver Keene's office stood. Oliver Keene said many businesses used similar network routes. Daniel Price, sitting quietly at the back as a witness to document handling, said that was true in a broad sense but did not explain the pattern. Daniel Price did not overstate it. That made the point stronger. Then Helen Moore asked why the independent reviewer was connected to Oliver Keene. Peter Langford said small towns required practical flexibility. Aisha Rahman said conflicts required disclosure. Another trustee asked whether Peter Langford had instructed Oliver Keene to use Ruth Whitaker's payment batch for donor materials. Peter Langford said the phrase had been taken out of context. Ruth Whitaker looked at him. She had expected anger, but what she felt was sadness sharpened by disgust. He was still relying on tone. He thought if he sounded reasonable enough, the room would forget the words. The trustees voted to suspend Oliver Keene's advisory role pending independent investigation. They also voted narrowly to refer governance concerns to the Charity Commission and appoint a truly independent firm to review the accounts. Peter Langford voted against both. The next morning, the town knew there had been a meeting. It did not know details, but silence had changed texture. At the bakery, the woman behind the counter asked Ruth Whitaker whether she wanted her usual seeded loaf. It was an ordinary question. Ruth Whitaker almost cried because of it. She did not cry in the bakery. She paid for the loaf and walked home slowly under a pale sky. The independent accounting firm was based in Exeter and had no ties to Hartleigh Bay. Its lead reviewer, Michael Trent, was brisk, polite, and immune to local charm. Michael Trent asked for bank records, invoices, trustee minutes, login information where obtainable, supplier contracts, email archives, and expense approvals. Michael Trent did not care that Peter Langford knew the mayor. Michael Trent did not care that Oliver Keene spoke softly. Michael Trent cared about sequences. Sequences told the story. The charity had received a large legacy 18 months earlier from a retired fisherman named Leonard Ash. The money was restricted for winter support and emergency repairs for elderly residents. Ruth Whitaker had insisted the restriction be recorded clearly. Peter Langford had celebrated the gift publicly. 6 months after the legacy arrived, new suppliers appeared. Some were real companies providing inflated or unnecessary services. Some were thin entities connected to acquaintances of Oliver Keene. One consultancy payment traveled through a business account and then into repayment of a private loan linked to Peter Langford's failing guesthouse project. Another payment funded community outreach branding, but was eventually traced to invoices for a luxury networking event Peter Langford had hosted under his own company name. The pattern was not crude theft from a cash box, it was worse in a way. It was intelligent enough to hide behind respectable language. It used governance fatigue, digital complexity, and misplaced trust. It relied on the assumption that older volunteers would not challenge professional men who spoke in acronyms. Michael Trent found that Ruth Whitaker's recorded objections had been omitted from later minutes. Clara Finch's scans restored them. Michael Trent found that payment approval notes attributed to Ruth Whitaker were inconsistent with her handwriting and sometimes created after the payment date. Michael Trent found that Ruth Whitaker's user credentials had likely been reset after a mandate variation form with questionable signatures. The bank's investigation remained separate, but its findings aligned with his concerns. The mandate form contained the small error that began to break Oliver Keene. One witness' signature was dated on a day the named witness had been in Spain attending a niece's wedding. They also voted narrowly to refer governance concerns to the Charity Commission and appoint a truly independent firm to review the accounts. Peter Langford voted against both. The next morning, the town knew there had been a meeting. It did not know details, but silence had changed texture. At the bakery, the woman behind the counter asked Ruth Whitaker whether she wanted her usual seeded loaf. It was an ordinary question. Ruth Whitaker almost cried because of it. She did not cry in the bakery. She paid for the loaf and walked home slowly under a pale sky. The independent accounting firm was based in Exeter and had no ties to Hartleigh Bay. Its lead reviewer, Michael Trent, was brisk, polite, and immune to local charm. Michael Trent asked for bank records, invoices, trustee minutes, login information where obtainable, supplier contracts, email archives, and expense approvals. Michael Trent did not care that Peter Langford knew the mayor. Michael Trent did not care that Oliver Keene spoke softly. Michael Trent cared about sequences. Sequences told the story. The charity had received a large legacy 18 months earlier from a retired fisherman named Leonard Ash. The money was restricted for winter support and emergency repairs for elderly residents. Ruth Whitaker had insisted the restriction be recorded clearly. Peter Langford had celebrated the gift publicly. 6 months after the legacy arrived, new suppliers appeared. Some were real companies providing inflated or unnecessary services. Some were thin entities connected to acquaintances of Oliver Keene. One consultancy payment traveled through a business account and then into repayment of a private loan linked to Peter Langford's failing guesthouse project. Another payment funded community outreach branding, but was eventually traced to invoices for a luxury networking event Peter Langford had hosted under his own company name. The pattern was not crude theft from a cash box, it was worse in a way. It was intelligent enough to hide behind respectable language. It used governance fatigue, digital complexity, and misplaced trust. It relied on the assumption that older volunteers would not challenge professional men who spoke in acronyms. Michael Trent found that Ruth Whitaker's recorded objections had been omitted from later minutes. Clara Finch's scans restored them. Michael Trent found that payment approval notes attributed to Ruth Whitaker were inconsistent with her handwriting and sometimes created after the payment date. Michael Trent found that Ruth Whitaker's user credentials had likely been reset after a mandate variation form with questionable signatures. The bank's investigation remained separate, but its findings aligned with his concerns. The mandate form contained the small error that began to break Oliver Keene. One witness' signature was dated on a day the named witness had been in Spain attending a niece's wedding. The witness was a retired solicitor named Martin Vale. Martin Vale was offended with the cold fury of a man whose reputation had been used without permission. Martin Vale provided travel records, copies of boarding passes, and a statement that he had not witnessed any signature. The second error was smaller. Ruth Whitaker's signature on the form used a capital W that matched neither her bank signature nor her passport. It did, however, resemble the way Oliver Keene had written her name on a sticky note found attached to a scanned payment list in his office files. That alone did not prove forgery, but in the company of other facts, it became part of the same dark pattern. Oliver Keene stopped attending charity meetings. Peter Langford tried to separate himself from Oliver Keene. He told trustees that he had trusted the accountant's professional competence. He said any irregularities were operational. He said he had been focused on fundraising and could not be expected to examine every payment. He expressed sadness about Ruth Whitaker's distress without admitting he had caused it. Then Clara Finch remembered the voicemail. It came from an old habit. The charity office still had a landline with an answering machine. Because many older residents disliked online forms, messages were usually deleted after notes were made. But when the chapel phone system was upgraded in September, Clara Finch had been asked to save the old voicemail files in case any applicant details were still needed. She had copied them to an archive folder and forgotten. In one message from late June, Peter Langford's voice was audible. He must have thought he had ended the call, or perhaps the office machine had recorded a conversation after a missed transfer. The audio was muffled, but clear enough in parts. Peter Langford said, "Ruth Whitaker won't question it if Oliver Keene puts it through with the usual batch." Then another voice, likely Oliver Keene, said, "She already asked twice." Peter Langford replied, "Then make her look tired. People will believe tired." Ruth Whitaker listened once. Then she asked Clara Finch to stop the recording. The room was very still. There are sentences that do not merely reveal wrongdoing, they reveal how little a person thought of you. Make her look tired. People will believe tired. It was not just strategy. It was a verdict on her age, her widowhood, her body, her place in the world. Ruth Whitaker went home and sat in Arthur Whitaker's chair. For the first time since the scandal began, she wept without trying to stop herself. Not because she was weak, because she finally understood the full insult. The next day, she gave the voicemail file to Aisha Rahman, who advised preserving the original, documenting how it had been found, and providing it to the independent reviewer and trustees. The evidence would need careful handling. Audio could be challenged, context could be argued. But again, it did not stand alone. Peter Langford's defense began to collapse slowly, then all at once. The bank completed its internal review and confirmed that several disputed transactions had not been consistent with Ruth Whitaker's normal access profile. It also confirmed that the mandate change had been accepted on documents now subject to serious concern. The bank reimbursed certain unauthorized losses to the charity provisionally while pursuing recovery channels, and it cooperated with the charity's external investigation. It did not announce guilt in dramatic language. Banks rarely do. But its conclusions stripped away the lie that Ruth Whitaker had been the obvious source of the problem. The independent review report was devastating. It identified failures in trustee oversight, conflicts involving Oliver Keene, unexplained financial benefit connected to entities linked to Peter Langford, inadequate documentation, altered minutes, and evidence that Ruth Whitaker's concerns had been minimized or removed. It recommended reporting to regulators and law enforcement for potential fraud and forgery investigation. It also stated that no evidence had been found that Ruth Whitaker personally benefited from the disputed transactions or knowingly authorized them. No evidence. For months, Ruth Whitaker had lived under the weight of people's certainty. Now the official language was dry, careful, and life-giving. No evidence. When the trustees received the report, Peter Langford resigned as chairman to avoid distraction. His resignation letter praised the charity, expressed concern for vulnerable residents, and described the investigation as a painful misunderstanding. He did not apologize to Ruth Whitaker. Oliver Keene sent no letter. His accountancy office closed for several days. A notice appeared saying appointments would be rearranged. Later, people heard that professional complaints had been made and that police had interviewed him under caution. Ruth Whitaker did not follow every detail. Aisha Rahman told her processes would take time. Evidence would be assessed. Charges, if brought, would not appear overnight. Hartleigh Bay wanted a quicker ending. Towns enjoy a fall, but they become impatient with repair. People wanted to know whether Peter Langford would be arrested, whether Oliver Keene would go to prison, whether Ruth Whitaker would sue, whether the charity would survive. They wanted the story to become clean. It did not. Justice came in stages. The Charity Commission opened a regulatory compliance case into the Harbor Light Benevolent Fund's governance. The trustees had to adopt new controls, replace compromised records, and report the losses properly. Oliver Keene faced professional disciplinary action and later admitted misconduct related to false documentation and improper handling of charity funds. Peter Langford denied criminal intent for longer, claiming he had relied on advice and misunderstood restrictions. But civil recovery proceedings and the documentary trail forced settlements that cost him money, reputation, and the polished future he had been selling to others. Months later, Peter Langford's guesthouse project failed. The local paper reported it as a business collapse. People in Hartleigh Bay read between the lines. But the person who surprised Ruth Whitaker most was Oliver Keene. He wrote to her from an address outside town. Aisha Rahman reviewed the letter before Ruth Whitaker read it. It was not an excuse, though it contained explanations. Oliver Keene wrote that his practice had been failing. He had debts, a mother's care fees, and a terror of being exposed as unsuccessful. Peter Langford had made the first suggestion, framing it as temporary borrowing against funds that would be restored after a donor pledge came in. Oliver Keene had known it was wrong. Then, when Ruth Whitaker asked questions, he had helped turn suspicion toward her because admitting the truth would destroy him. He wrote that he had watched the town blame her and said nothing. That sentence mattered more than the rest. Ruth Whitaker did not forgive him immediately. She was not sure forgiveness was something a person could produce on demand like a receipt. She wrote back only once. She said his remorse should be measured by what he did next, not by what he felt. She asked him to cooperate fully with every investigation and to tell the truth without protecting himself at her expense. Oliver Keene did, not perfectly, not heroically, but enough. His later statement helped establish how Peter Langford had directed the false narrative and pressured him to produce documents that made Ruth Whitaker appear unreliable. It did not erase his responsibility. It did show that conscience, though late, was not entirely dead. Peter Langford never wrote to Ruth Whitaker. Instead, Peter Langford tried to return to public life through another committee 2 towns away. The attempt lasted 3 weeks. Hartleigh Bay had learned how to forward documents by then. The hardest part for Ruth Whitaker was not proving innocence. It was living among people who had doubted her after innocence became undeniable. Some came with flowers, some came with cards. Some stopped her near the pier and said they had always wondered if the story was wrong. Ruth Whitaker learned that many people rewrite their own cowardice once truth is safe. They claimed private doubts they had never spoken. They claimed loyalty they had not shown. They wanted absolution without discomfort. Helen Moore came properly. Helen Moore arrived without flowers, which Ruth Whitaker appreciated. Flowers often ask the injured person to admire the apology. Helen Moore sat at Ruth Whitaker's kitchen table and said she had failed. Not been misled, not been confused, failed. She said she had trusted status over character. She said Peter Langford's confidence had felt easier to believe than Ruth Whitaker's distress. She said she had been afraid of harming the charity and had harmed it more by staying quiet. Ruth Whitaker listened. Then Ruth Whitaker said she could not return to the old friendship as if nothing had happened. Helen Moore nodded. Ruth Whitaker said she was willing to build a different one slowly. If Helen Moore accepted that trust would not be restored by sentiment. Helen Moore cried again, but this time the tears did not ask Ruth Whitaker to carry them. She wiped her own face and said yes, that was conditional forgiveness. It did not sparkle. It worked. The Harbor Light Benevolent Fund almost closed. Donors were angry, beneficiaries were embarrassed, trustees were exhausted. The easy solution would have been to fold the charity, apologize publicly, and let another organization absorb the work. Some wanted that. Starting over would have avoided the daily shame of repair. Ruth Whitaker opposed closure. At the extraordinary general meeting, she stood in the chapel hall where she had once been humiliated. Her hands shook slightly, so she placed them on the lectern. People noticed. This time, no one mistook it for weakness. Ruth Whitaker said the charity had been wounded because good people assumed goodness could run without safeguards. She said kindness without records was vulnerable to anyone who knew how to sound respectable. She said older volunteers were often praised for dedication, but denied authority when systems became digital. She said beneficiaries should not lose help because trustees had failed to protect trust placed in them. She did not ask to become treasurer again. That surprised people. Ruth Whitaker said she would not return to the role that had been used to frame her. Instead, she proposed a new structure: independent bookkeeping, rotating trustee review, dual authorization enforced by the bank, published summaries, safeguarding training, and a confidential route for volunteers to raise concerns. She also proposed a small program teaching older residents how to read bank statements, identify manipulation, and ask questions without shame. Peter Langford had wanted her resignation to become the end of her usefulness. Instead, the scandal made her more dangerous to men like him. The motion passed. In the months that followed, Ruth Whitaker became something she had never intended to be: a public voice, not loud, not polished, but trusted in a new way. She spoke at the library about financial abuse and coercive control. She helped Grace Bell organize a bank awareness session for older customers. She sat with pensioners who had received suspicious calls and told them embarrassment was the fraudster's second theft. She also insisted on tea breaks. People who expected a crusader found a woman who still worried about overbaked scones, still cut coupons from the local paper, and still spoke to Arthur Whitaker's photograph when the boiler made strange noises. Ruth Whitaker did not become fearless. She became unwilling to confuse fear with instruction. The young volunteer, Clara Finch, changed too. Before the scandal, Clara Finch had planned to leave Hartleigh Bay for a job in Bristol. She thought the town was too small, too narrow, too full of old stories. Afterward, she still left for training, but she returned twice a month to help with the charity's records and digital systems. Ruth Whitaker told her not to make loyalty into a cage. Clara Finch said she was not staying from guilt. She was staying because records were a kind of justice. Ruth Whitaker smiled at that. The phrase sounded familiar. Daniel Price became secretary of the new oversight committee, though he complained about the title. He said committees had ruined more good coffee than war ever did. Still, he attended every meeting with sharpened pencils and an expression that discouraged nonsense. Grace Bell was promoted at the bank. She never discussed confidential details, but she visited one of the charity's public sessions and explained, in plain language, how authorized users, payment approvals, and complaint processes worked. She told the room that asking for written confirmation was not rude, it was wise. Several older residents applauded. One man muttered that banks should have said so years ago. Grace Bell said he was probably right. Ruth Whitaker's own life did not become easy. There were still mornings when she woke with the old dread before remembering the worst had passed. There were still shops she avoided because the memory of turned backs lingered near the door. There were still people who overcorrected, treating her like a local saint because they had once treated her like a thief. Both versions were false. She was neither saint nor scandal. She was a woman who had been harmed and had survived without surrendering her name. One winter afternoon, almost a year after the first accusation, Ruth Whitaker walked along the seafront. The tide was low. Wet sand reflected a gray sky. Children in bright coats chased one another near the arcade, while older couples sat in parked cars eating chips from paper trays. Hartleigh Bay looked ordinary again, but Ruth Whitaker no longer believed ordinary meant safe. Near the pier, a man approached her. His name was Alan Briggs. The charity had once paid for a stair rail in his flat after a hip operation. During the scandal, he had crossed the street to avoid her. Ruth Whitaker remembered. She suspected he did too. Alan Briggs removed his cap. He said he owed her an apology. His voice cracked on the last word. Ruth Whitaker waited. Alan Briggs said he had believed what people said because believing it cost him nothing. Then he realized it had cost her nearly everything. He said he was ashamed. Ruth Whitaker looked at the sea before answering. She said shame could be useful if it taught a person to act differently next time. Then she asked whether his stair rail was still holding. Alan Briggs laughed once, surprised and tearful. He said yes. Ruth Whitaker said good. Then she continued walking. She did not absolve the town all at once. A town is not a single heart. It is many people making separate choices and then pretending the result was weather. Some had been cruel. Some had been frightened. Some had been lazy. Some had been decent too late. Ruth Whitaker learned to accept apologies without letting them rewrite the past. The legal aftermath stretched across another year. Oliver Keene lost his professional standing and repaid what he could through a formal arrangement. He was not the mastermind, but he had been the instrument, and instruments can cut deeply. His cooperation reduced some consequences and increased others. He had to live with both. Peter Langford fought harder. He hired expensive representation, challenged interpretations, and claimed personal persecution. Yet documents do not tire in the way people do. The audit trail remained patient. The email metadata remained where it was. The voicemail did not become kinder with time. The false witness date did not move Martin Vale back from Spain. The money did not explain itself. Eventually, Peter Langford accepted a settlement in the civil recovery action and withdrew from several public roles. Later proceedings brought penalties that mattered less to Ruth Whitaker than the public record. She did not need him ruined for pleasure. She needed the truth placed somewhere official enough that no whisper could easily bury it again. When the local paper finally printed a careful article about the investigation's findings, the headline called Ruth Whitaker cleared. Ruth Whitaker disliked the word. Cleared made it sound as though she had been dirty until authority rinsed her clean. But she clipped the article anyway and placed it in the yellow folder. Then she added a note in her own handwriting. I was never what they said I was. The yellow folder eventually became too full. Ruth Whitaker bought a larger box file from the stationers and labeled it Harbor Light Matter. Daniel Price said it sounded like a detective novel. Clara Finch said it sounded like a warning. Ruth Whitaker said it sounded like something finished enough to file. On the anniversary of Arthur Whitaker's death, Ruth Whitaker visited the churchyard with fresh flowers. She told Arthur Whitaker what had happened, though not because she believed he did not know. Habit is a form of love. She spoke of Peter Langford, Oliver Keene, Clara Finch, Daniel Price, Grace Bell, and Helen Moore. She spoke of the charity Survival. She spoke of how tired she had been. Then Ruth Whitaker said something she had not admitted aloud before. She said she had been frightened that, without Arthur Whitaker, there would be no one left to witness who she truly was. The wind moved through the yew tree. Somewhere beyond the wall, a car door slammed. Life continued with its usual lack of ceremony. Ruth Whitaker stood there until the cold reached her knees. Then she touched the top of the stone and went home. That evening, the Harbor Light Benevolent Fund held its first winter supper under the new governance rules. It was not a grand affair. There were baked potatoes, vegetable soup, donated pies, and a raffle with prizes nobody particularly wanted but everyone pretended to admire. The account's summary was pinned openly on the notice board. Payments over the threshold were listed by category. The trustees took questions. Some were awkward. Ruth Whitaker considered that healthy. At the end of the evening, Clara Finch wheeled out a small projector. Ruth Whitaker thought it was for donor slides. Instead, a photograph appeared on the wall. Ruth Whitaker 20 years earlier, standing beside the charity's old coal voucher table, laughing at something outside the frame. Then another photograph, Ruth Whitaker delivering blankets. Another, Ruth Whitaker with Arthur Whitaker at a summer fundraiser. Another, Ruth Whitaker sitting beside an elderly man filling in a form. The room grew quiet. Helen Moore stepped forward and read a short statement from the trustees. It did not call Ruth Whitaker an inspiration. Ruth Whitaker had forbidden that word. It said the charity had failed in its duty to protect a volunteer who had protected others for decades. It said the new safeguards would be named the Whitaker Principles: transparency, shared authority, documented decisions, respect for older volunteers, and the right to question without retaliation. Ruth Whitaker had not approved the name. She would have objected if asked. Because she had not been asked, it was already printed on the program. People stood. For a moment, Ruth Whitaker wanted to sit down. Applause can feel like pressure when one has survived accusation. It asks the body to receive what it once begged for. She looked toward the back of the hall, where Daniel Price was pretending not to be emotional. Clara Finch was crying openly, and Grace Bell had both hands clasped under her chin. Ruth Whitaker remained standing, not triumphant. Not healed in the easy way stories sometimes demand, but present. After the supper, a woman named Joan Mercer approached. Joan Mercer was 81 and had recently stopped attending community lunches because her nephew had begun managing her money and telling her she was too confused to handle bills. Joan Mercer spoke in a whisper. She said she did not know whether anything was wrong, But she no longer received bank letters, and her nephew became angry when she asked. Ruth Whitaker felt the old nurse in her rise. Not alarm, attention. She did not promise rescue. She did not dramatize. She asked Joan Mercer to come to the library session on Tuesday and bring whatever papers she had. She said there were people who could explain options. She said being unsure was enough reason to ask. Joan Mercer nodded, eyes wet with relief. The following Tuesday, Joan Mercer arrived at the library with a carrier bag of envelopes folded so tightly they looked as if they had been carried through a storm. Ruth Whitaker did not touch the papers at first. She asked Joan Mercer to sit. She asked whether Joan Mercer wanted tea. She asked whether anyone knew she had come. Joan Mercer said her nephew thought she was at a knitting group. Ruth Whitaker heard the shame in that sentence. It was not the shame of wrongdoing. It was the shame forced on people when they have to sneak toward their own safety. Grace Bell had arranged for a private corner, not as a bank appointment, but as part of the public education session. A volunteer from an older person's advice charity attended too. Nobody accused the nephew. Nobody made promises. They simply opened envelopes, sorted dates, and looked for patterns. There were changes of address for bank statements. There were online transfers Joan Mercer did not recognize. There was a loan application Joan Mercer remembered signing only because her nephew said it was a form to reduce tax. There were letters from a finance company written in language that made debt sound like administration. The amounts were not as large as the money stolen from the Harbor Light Benevolent Fund, but Ruth Whitaker knew harm was not measured only by size. To a woman living on a pension, a few £1,000s could become winter, food, independence, and sleep. Joan Mercer kept apologizing for being foolish. Ruth Whitaker stopped her gently. Ruth Whitaker said foolish people do not ask for help when something feels wrong. Frightened people do. Trusting people do. Isolated people do. And there was a great difference between being deceived and being stupid. Joan Mercer looked at her for a long time. Then she began to breathe differently. That afternoon did not end with sirens or victory. It ended with a list. Contact the bank's vulnerable customer team, request copies of documents, speak with the advice charity about possible financial abuse, check whether any power of attorney existed, and consider contacting the local authority safeguarding team if Joan Mercer felt pressured or unsafe. It was ordinary, procedural, and therefore hopeful. Ruth Whitaker walked home afterward with a new understanding of her own ordeal. Peter Langford had injured more than the charity. He had exposed a pattern that existed in many polite rooms. Older people were often told to be grateful for help without being allowed to question the helper. They were praised for independence until their independence inconvenienced someone. Then concern appeared, soft and suffocating, and decisions began to move elsewhere. Ruth Whitaker had once believed abuse announced itself with shouting. Now she knew it could arrive carrying a clipboard, wearing a good coat, or using the voice of a relative who said, "I'm only doing this for you." The library sessions grew. At first, only 6 people came, mostly because there was free tea. By the 4th month, the small meeting room was full. People brought pension letters, charity forms, insurance renewals, funeral plan leaflets, and mobile phones filled with messages from strangers pretending to be grandchildren. Some came for themselves. Some came for a friend. Ruth Whitaker never challenged that phrase. Sometimes dignity needed a little disguise before it could enter the room. Aisha Rahman visited once and explained lasting powers of attorney in plain terms. She made clear that appointing someone to help with decisions did not mean surrendering one's humanity. The person appointed had duties. Records mattered. Capacity was not a casual insult to throw at an older person who disagreed. If concerns arose, there were ways to question, revoke, or report. Ruth Whitaker watched faces change as people learned that the law, though imperfect and often slow, did not automatically belong to the loudest relative or the smoothest advisor. Daniel Price gave a short talk called "How Not to Be Bullied by a Spreadsheet." He made 3 jokes, 2 of which were good. He taught people to look at dates, amounts, payees, and missing pages. He said a gap was also a fact. Ruth Whitaker liked that line and wrote it in her notebook. Grace Bell explained bank language. Pending, cleared, mandate, authorized user, complaint reference, fraud team. She translated each term into ordinary speech. She told them to write down names and times when they phoned institutions. She told them to ask for letters, not just reassurance. She told them no legitimate bank employee should become angry because a customer wanted to verify a request. Clara Finch created printed checklists with large text. She left blank spaces where people could write their own trusted contacts. At the bottom of every checklist, she printed one sentence in bold: "I am allowed to ask questions before I sign." Ruth Whitaker pinned that sentence beside the charity office desk, yet even good work carried cost. Some evenings, after helping others untangle fear, Ruth Whitaker came home feeling as if the scandal had happened again, in different clothing. She would make tea and forget to drink it. She would stand in the hallway listening to the cottage settle and feel the old loneliness at her back. People assumed public vindication cured private injury. It did not. Being believed after months of disbelief was not the same as never having been doubted. An apology could not return the Sundays when she sat in chapel feeling judgment pressed between her shoulder blades. A report could not restore the first night. She wondered whether her own town would let her grow old under a lie. One evening, Clara Finch found Ruth Whitaker staring at the charity's new accounts summary after everyone else had gone. Clara Finch asked whether Ruth Whitaker was all right. Ruth Whitaker almost said yes. She had been trained by age, grief, and English manners to reduce pain into manageability. But she was tired of teaching others honesty while offering politeness in place of truth. Ruth Whitaker said no, not badly, just no. Clara Finch pulled out a chair and sat down. Ruth Whitaker said she was grateful for justice, grateful for help, grateful for every restore record and every person protected since. But sometimes she missed the woman she had been before suspicion entered every room. She missed trusting compliments. She missed believing that service would be recognized as service. She missed not knowing how easily a careful life could be made to look dirty by people who understood appearances. Clara Finch did not rush to comfort her. That was one of Clara Finch's gifts. She allowed sadness to exist without trying to decorate it. After a while, Clara Finch said maybe the old trust had not been foolish, only incomplete. Ruth Whitaker asked what she meant. Clara Finch said, trust without questions had protected Peter Langford. Trust with questions protected everyone else. Ruth Whitaker considered this. Then she said Clara Finch had become annoyingly wise. Clara Finch said she had learned from the best and the worst of people in the same year. That night, Ruth Whitaker slept more peacefully than she had expected. Not because the grief was gone, but because she had finally admitted that recovery was not ingratitude. A person could be thankful and wounded. A person could be vindicated and still tired. A person could forgive some people, distrust others, and continue living without fitting into anyone's neat moral ending. The town changed in small, testable ways. The chapel began publishing basic committee minutes. The community library required 2 volunteers to approve any cash handling event. The Veterans Club invited Ruth Whitaker to speak after one of its members nearly lost money to an investment scheme. A local solicitor offered 1 free monthly clinic for older residents worried about documents they did not understand. Even the bakery started keeping a small stack of fraud awareness leaflets near the till, between jam tarts and sausage rolls. None of these changes made Hartleigh Bay pure. Ruth Whitaker did not believe in pure communities anymore. But each change made wrongdoing a little harder, and silence a little less comfortable. The mayor invited Ruth Whitaker to accept a civic award. Ruth Whitaker declined. The mayor was confused. The award, he explained, was meant to honor resilience and community service. There would be photographs. The local paper would attend. It would help restore confidence. Ruth Whitaker said confidence did not need a photograph of her holding a plaque. It needed people attending training, reading accounts, and listening when older residents raised concerns. She suggested the council fund transport for isolated pensioners to reach advice sessions instead. The mayor said the budget was tight. Ruth Whitaker said plaques were cheaper than responsibility. The transport fund appeared 2 months later, modest but real. Daniel Price said Ruth Whitaker had become impossible. Ruth Whitaker said she had become experienced. One person remained difficult, Helen Moore. Conditional forgiveness required more work than either woman had expected. Helen Moore wanted to be useful. Sometimes she overdid it, hovering around Ruth Whitaker with offers of help that felt too much like guilt. Ruth Whitaker had to tell her plainly that remorse was not a debt to be paid directly to the injured person forever. It should be turned outward. So Helen Moore began visiting housebound residents with library books. At first, Ruth Whitaker suspected performative repentance. Then Helen Moore kept going in bad weather when no one praised her. Ruth Whitaker noticed. She did not announce that trust was returning. She simply allowed Helen Moore to pour tea one afternoon, without feeling the need to watch every movement. That was how some repairs happened. Not by speeches, but by repetition. Joan Mercer's situation also moved slowly. The nephew denied wrongdoing and accused others of interfering. He said Joan Mercer was confused. He said Ruth Whitaker was filling her head with suspicion. He said families should not be dragged through bureaucracy because of gossip. Ruth Whitaker recognized the music immediately. This time, however, Joan Mercer was not alone. The bank flagged unusual activity. The advice charity helped her request documents. A safeguarding referral led to a careful assessment. It emerged that Joan Mercer had not understood several financial forms and had been pressured to sign while unwell after a hospital stay. Some transactions were reversed. Others required negotiation. The nephew was not marched away in handcuffs, but his control ended. Joan Mercer chose a different trusted arrangement, with proper advice and records. At the next library session, Joan Mercer stood to speak. Her voice shook, but she did not sit down. She said she had thought asking for help would prove she was losing her mind. Instead, it proved she still had one. The room went silent. Then people applauded, not loudly, but with recognition. Ruth Whitaker looked at Joan Mercer and understood that this was the answer to Peter Langford's contempt. Not Peter Langford's punishment, not the public report, not even Ruth Whitaker's cleared name. The real answer was every older person who learned to question the hand reaching into their life, without feeling ashamed of the question. Peter Langford had tried to turn Ruth Whitaker into a warning about decline. Ruth Whitaker had become a warning about underestimation. There was another letter from Oliver Keene that spring. This one was shorter. He wrote that he had begun volunteering with a debt advice charity under supervision, doing basic administrative work unrelated to client money. He did not ask for approval. He said he understood if Ruth Whitaker never answered. He included a copy of a restitution payment schedule. Ruth Whitaker read it twice and placed it in the Harbor Light Matter file. She did not reply. Silence, she had learned, could be cruelty or boundary depending on who used it and why. In this case, it was boundary. Peter Langford appeared once more in Hartleigh Bay before leaving the area. Ruth Whitaker saw him outside the old guest house, speaking sharply into a phone while removal men carried boxes. He looked smaller without an audience. For a second, Ruth Whitaker felt the pull of imagined confrontation. She could walk over. She could say something final. She could tell him he had failed to destroy her. Then she realized he already knew. Ruth Whitaker crossed the street, not to avoid him, but because the bakery was on the other side and she wanted seeded bread. That choice pleased her more than any speech would have. That was when Ruth Whitaker understood what had been returned to her. Not merely reputation. Not merely a role, authority, the kind earned through suffering but not defined by it. The kind that tells another frightened person, I know this road, and you do not have to walk it blind. Spring came slowly that year. Hartleigh Bay shook off winter in patches. Daffodils by the church wall, cafe chairs returned to pavements, gulls becoming bolder, tourists appearing too early in thin jackets. Ruth Whitaker opened her windows and let the salt air into the cottage. The lavender by the gate had gone woody, so Clara Finch helped cut it back. Daniel Price claimed to supervise while doing very little. Grace Bell brought a leaflet proof for the bank session. Helen Moore delivered seed cake and did not stay too long. Life did not become what it had been. That was grief and mercy both. The old version of Hartleigh Bay, the one Ruth Whitaker had trusted without question, was gone. But perhaps it had never existed exactly as she remembered. Perhaps every community contains both care and cowardice, both generosity and appetite, both hands that lift and hands that search pockets while pretending to steady you. The lesson was not to stop trusting. A life without trust becomes its own prison. The lesson was to trust with records, with boundaries, with the humility to ask for proof and the courage to provide it. Ruth Whitaker still volunteered, but she no longer allowed anyone to praise her into silence. When a new trustee said paperwork felt unfriendly, Ruth Whitaker said paperwork was how friendliness survived temptation. When an older man said he did not want to make a fuss about a suspicious payment, Ruth Whitaker said predators counted on good manners. When a donor asked whether all the new controls were really necessary, Ruth Whitaker said yes with such calm finality that the donor wrote a larger check. One afternoon, Ruth Whitaker received a small parcel with no return address. Inside was the original brass nameplate from the charity treasurer's desk. It had disappeared during the scandal. The plate was scratched, but readable. Ruth Whitaker could have put it back on the desk. Instead, she placed it on the bookshelf in her cottage beside Arthur Whitaker's photograph, not as a trophy, as evidence of a life that had been challenged and not taken. There are people who believe karma arrives like lightning, a sudden strike, a satisfying blaze. But Ruth Whitaker learned that consequences often move like tidewater. Quietly, persistently, reaching places the proud thought were dry. Peter Langford did not fall because Ruth Whitaker shouted louder. He fell because every falsehood needed another falsehood to hold it up, and eventually the structure became too heavy. Oliver Keene did not confess because Ruth Whitaker begged. He confessed because guilt, once documented, had fewer places to hide. The town did not change because it was shamed for 1 week. It changed because Ruth Whitaker refused to let comfort replace accountability. As for Ruth Whitaker, she did not regain dignity because others finally returned it. That was the deepest truth. Dignity had never fully left her. It had been insulted, doubted, crowded, and covered with other people's fear. But it had remained in the way she kept records when her hands shook, in the way she walked into chapel with her back straight, in the way she accepted help without surrendering judgment, and in the way she refused to become cruel after cruelty found her. Years later, people in Hartleigh Bay still told the story. Some told it badly. They made it simpler, sharper, more dramatic. They said Ruth Whitaker exposed a fraud. They said Ruth Whitaker brought down a powerful man. They said Ruth Whitaker saved the charity. All of that was partly true but incomplete. The real story was quieter. A widow was betrayed by people who mistook age for weakness and kindness for stupidity. A town believed a lie because the lie was convenient. A few ordinary people chose evidence over gossip. A bank log, an email, a voicemail, a scanned minute, and a wrong date on a form did what shouting could not do. They gave truth a spine. And Ruth Whitaker, who had once feared dying unseen, became the person others came to when they were afraid of being erased. On the last page of the new volunteer handbook, beneath the Whitaker Principles, the charity printed a sentence Ruth Whitaker had spoken at a library session. She had not meant it for publication. Clara Finch heard it, wrote it down, and insisted it belonged there. It said, "Never let anyone make you feel rude for asking where the money went, who signed the paper, or why your voice no longer counts." Ruth Whitaker complained that it was too long for a handbook. Clara Finch said some truths needed the space. Ruth Whitaker had no answer to that, so the sentence stayed.